So, hi folks, my name is Ed Friedman. I'm the chairman of Friends of Merrymeeting Bay. We have no other board members here tonight, I don't think. I am. I want to thank the library for having us, the Dresden Library here, Bridge Academy. Sue's here, a librarian somewhere around here. And the Dresden Conservation Commission, who is co-sponsoring this event with us. Also Patagonia. Okay. So, yeah, you'll see some stuff on the back about Friends of Merrymeeting Bay quickly. You know, we do research and advocacy work, done some great stuff around the circulation patterns in the bay. Obviously doing a lot with archaeology over the years with the Maine Historic Preservation Commission. And we have an active education program. Probably reach out to a couple of thousand kids a year in all of these areas. Land conservation, we've protected over 1,500 acres of land around the bay in the last probably 8 years or so. And yeah, education, research, advocacy, and land conservation. Those are the four main areas we work in. We do membership activities as well. So we've got obviously a speaker series like this from October to May, and we do outings in the summer. If you're not a member, and I think a lot of you aren't, we'd love it if you would join us. It's not very much to join, and we welcome your participation. We only have one paid staff person, and we're actually in between right now. So there's a lot of volunteer participation in the group, about 125 active volunteers out of a membership of over 400. So that's pretty impressive. So with that, so tonight we have Arthur Spiess, who many of you know. Art's got a PhD in anthropology from Harvard back in 1978. He's been a senior archaeologist with the Maine Historic Preservation Commission for a really long time. And the commission, well, I don't know how many years, but how many?
Since 78.
Since came right to here. So he came right to here, and boom. So yeah. So he's been on the board of the Maine Archaeological Society, probably still is. Serves as editor of the editor of Archaeology of Eastern North America for the Eastern States Archaeological Federation. And as many of you know, the commission deals with both historical and prehistoric aspects of archaeology and anthropology, and Art's specialty is really prehistoric archaeology. So with that, Mr. Spiess, Dr. Spiess, I should say, right? And I'm going to give you this.
You're not going to turn. Oh, thank you. You're not going to turn the lights down, huh?
Well, we can experiment. People like to watch that.
Please. Well, I'm pleased to be able to tell this story to the Dresden Conservation Commission and the Friends of Merrymeeting Bay. It's quite a turnout tonight. First, I'll give you a background on the acquisition of the site itself, and then provide you with a very abbreviated summary of Maine prehistory for some context. And then we'll talk about the site archaeology. We've done a little bit of work on the site. It was a phone call in the summer of 2007 from Ed Friedman that started this 4-year saga. And it really has been a 4 years long trip. Ed said something like, quote, "The Hoodlet property in Dresden is being sold and a gravel subdivision road has been built from Route 128 out to the river. What are you going to do about it?" Something like that, right, Ed?
Close enough for government work.
You guys see the slides all right? Turn the lights off, please.
Turn partial light off. There.
Try another one. There you go.
All right.
For those few of you who may not know, the site is located here on the Kennebec River. That's the Swan Island, Richmond over here, Dresden on the east side of the river. It's just upstream from where the river widens out into Merrymeeting Bay down here. Ed was talking about former farm fields on the east side of the Kennebec River, these fields right here, from which many artifacts have been collected by avocational archaeologists, including scores of stone tools from about 9,000 to about 4,000 years old. Very old site. And now it seemed that work on a subdivision had started back in 2007. In fact, the new owners of the property at the time, Rick and Wanda Lang, had applied for a permit to put in a road to a possible 8-lot subdivision in June of 2007. The farmer who had owned the property had never allowed a professional archaeologist to test the site. This is the farm, and the archaeological site's out there. Only one avocational archaeologist, Maine Archaeological Society past president Dick Doyle, had had his collection from the site photographed at the Maine State Museum. So the landowner never allowed professional archaeologists on the site, but avocationals would come out there after the potato harvest or whatever and pick up stone tools. So in November of that year, 2007, Dick Doyle shared his knowledge of the size and contents of the site with me at our request. Dick Doyle is one of the heroes of this story because his information was critical to starting the effort to preserve the site. And this is courtesy of Ed from his helicopter looking east across the river. The site's here in this field. The site itself occupies an approximately 20-acre field on the east bank of the Kennebec, opposite the north end of Swan Island, as we've seen. Site number 2545 was assigned to the pre-European or prehistoric material on the site in 1994, again following Dick Doyle's original information. The site has gone by several names, Hoodlet Complex being used by Bruce Bork of the State Museum in a publication. We are calling it the Dresden Falls Archaic Site to avoid using any landowner's name. This is a huge habitation or campsite, seasonal campsite and workshop focused on fishing in the river. It's not a burial site. We haven't found any burials or any hint of them. And we'll return to the issue of the falls on the river and why we put the concept of a falls in the site name later in the lecture. Oops. If I trip and fall on my face, give me a second. Thank you. The Maine Historic Preservation Commission has worked closely with the Land for Maine's Future program for 20 years or more. All that work has been after purchase, assessment, and survey of the land for archaeological sites, which is part of the statute, by the way. We're supposed to do that, so that any sites that happen to be on these conservation purchases can be avoided and protected, especially during road and trail access work. Until recently, we could not ask the Land for Maine's Future Board program to buy an archaeological site as the primary value of a piece of land. It was not one of the original listed things that you could buy land for. Then in the 2007 legislative session, Passamaquoddy Tribal Representative Donald Soctoma got a bill passed to add, quote, significant undeveloped archaeological sites, close quote, to the list of purchase criteria for Land for Maine's future funding. So we can now work on protecting specific individual sites that are highly significant. The Dresden Falls Archaic Site is the first specific archaeological site to be purchased. It's taken us 4 years. I think I may do 1 or 2 of these a decade if we're lucky at this rate. For each Land for Maine's Future Board purchase, there must be a sponsoring state agency, and that sponsoring agency does a lot of the work, and that, in this case, meant me. I've not calculated my time contribution to the project, but it had been at least 5 or 6 months total time spread over the 4 years of the project. And I lost some sleep, too, in the process. So,
You and me both.
Pardon?
You and me both.
Too. Briefly, back to the landowner. Old farmer Hoodlet had passed away a few years ago. His property had been subdivided into 3 lots of about 30 acres each, I believe it was. Each one long and thin with frontage on Route 128. And on the Kennebec River, the property was subdivided so there was river frontage and road frontage. One of the Hoodlet siblings of the next generation sold most of his property to Rick and Wanda Lang in 2006. The Langs had owned and run a trailer park in this area, and they had sold the trailer park to buy the Hoodlet parcel. Their dream was to subdivide, build their dream house on the river, sell off the other lots. Rick Lang had been code enforcement officer for various towns in the region, so he knew the ordinances and state laws for building and subdivision. He was also quite handy with this little Kubota tractor that he owns, and did a lot of clearing and cleaning up of the property while he owned it. Rick Lang and a surveyor developed a subdivision plan, and he had a subdivision gravel road built to access the lots, and he started to work on the riverfront piece where they wanted to build a house. He had a drilled well put in, brought in power along poles along the gravel road to this power pole here, and he built a two-car garage and a workshop on a concrete slab. It's not on a full foundation, thank God, because there's archaeology still underneath the concrete slab. But turns out the garage was right in the middle of one of the best parts of the archaeological site. So he ran power from this power pole through a 70-yard long trench underground to the garage. And at the same time, he filed a subdivision plan with the town of Dresden and asked the planning board for consideration. The subdivision was too small to trigger state level review, so it was a town issue. And that was the state of affairs when Arthur Spiess got that call from Ed Friedman in 2007. And I wrote a letter to the Dresden Planning Board stating that there was an archaeological site on the property that was very probably significant, and that no construction should proceed without prior archaeological data recovery excavation. At the same time, Ed announced that the Friends of Merrymeeting Bay would fight the subdivision in keeping with their general principles of trying to limit development around Merrymeeting Bay and protect its water quality. I first met with the Langs in the fall of 2007, and I found out that they had been unaware of the archaeological site on their dream home location when they had purchased the property. Rick Lang took an interest in archaeology. He ended up making a collection, surface collection, and whenever he disturbed the dirt, he would pick up the artifacts. And he made it clear that we could come do archaeology. The Maine Historic Preservation Commission could come do archaeology with our money at any time. The Langs also gave us their support in writing for an application to the Land for Maine's Future Board for a grant for part of the money to acquire part of the property. We would negotiate about which part of the property, but it had to include the core of the archaeological site. The Langs were, in the language of the Land for Maine's Future program, a willing seller, at least for part of the property. Then I contacted Andy Stout, who the Archaeological Conservancy, that's a nationwide conservancy, in the fall of 2007, and we agreed that this would be a good joint project. The Archaeological Conservancy owns about 400 archaeological sites across the country and protects them from development. The Archaeological Conservancy in our conversations could hypothetically own the land. The Maine Historic Preservation Commission would hold a preservation agreement, which is an archaeological conservation easement on the property as the state's interest, at least if we could purchase some of it. Oops. Those arrangements allowed us to write and file a grant application with the Land for Maine's Future Board for Round 5 funding. We knew that we used what we knew of Dick Doyle, from Dick Doyle's information, to describe the archaeology on the site. We made a totally off-the-wall guess that the project would cost $400,000 to $500,000, and we asked the board for $338,000. Now these rounds of Land for Maine's Future Board funding, as you may recall, were funded by bond issues that were in the $30 to $50 million range each time. So they were doing lots of projects, and this was not out of line for a modest-sized project. Somewhat to my surprise, great joy, and simultaneous great trepidation, what I had gotten myself into, the Land for Maine's Future Board obligated $228,000 to purchase the property, and reminded me that funding had to be matched with half of that amount, another $114,000. Right, I thought to myself, sure. Never having done anything like this before. Ed's is a veteran at this kind of stuff, but I wasn't. We probably need more than that. The project actually cost me sleep, as I said, And the Archaeological Conservancy, thank goodness, committed $75,000 to the purchase immediately. We began a process of 2 years of negotiations with the Langs. We needed an appraisal. The first one came in at $500,000 for the riverfront half of the property only. We needed a survey and a boundary description. We needed what seemed like a zillion other details. The first appraisal had been done in early 2008. Then, as you remember, the housing bubble burst in the fall of 2008. The stock market crashed. The economy tumbled into a recession. Negotiations with the Langs dragged on. Then they advertised for the property for sale on the internet at one point. Of course, property in general was not selling. And as the winter of 2009 moved into 2010, I was resigned to losing the site or simply putting the project on hold for a long time. Enter an unsung hero of the story, and re-enter Friends of Merrymeeting Bay. Peter Axelsson, a friend of the Friends of Merrymeeting Bay who lives in Massachusetts and runs a business there, made an offer to the Langs to purchase the entire 26 plus acres of the land and the garage for about $400,000. He would act as a willing seller to complete the deal for the land with the Land for Maine's Future Board participation. Friends of Merrymeeting Bay would try to raise the funds to purchase the inland half of the property, which was worth much less, and reimburse Peter Axelsson for his costs without profit. So Peter Axelsson and Ed Friedman are heroes of this story, big time. So we got 4 so far: Dick Doyle, Donald Sochtoma, who changed the law, Ed, and Peter Axelsson. So we did it. Part of it, anyway. The Land for Maine's Future Board, Friends of Merrymeeting Bay, Archaeological Conservancy, Maine Historic Preservation purchased 14.2 acres on March 1st, 2011. The Archaeological Conservancy owns the property. That's 80% of the archaeological site. Friends of Merrymeeting Bay purchased the inland 12.5 acres from Peter Axelsson and turned it over to the Archaeological Conservancy, I believe, on the same day. So now the entire 26.7 acres that the Lang property is owned by the Conservancy, including the road frontage, the gravel road, and the garage. My commission, the Preservation Commission, holds a preservation agreement on the archaeological site, which allows us to control what happens there legally. But that's not quite the end of the story. The uphill 1/4 of the field here also has some of the archaeological site on it and some Revolutionary War era historic archaeology. It was owned by another Hoodlat heir and his wife, Phil and Tammy. I think they're happy that they're not faced with an 8-lot subdivision next door. They sold the upper part of the field to Peter Axelsson for the Friends of Merrymeeting Bay. That parcel has been approved for partial funding by Land for Maine's Future. That's pending right now, and that's what Ed was talking about in the beginning of the lecture, where he's still trying to raise enough funds to close on that property. The entire Dresden Falls archaic archaeological site, plus access and road frontage, will be owned and managed by the Archaeological Conservancy, jointly with the Maine Historic Preservation Commission and the Friends of Merrymeeting Bay, holding a conservation easement on the biological values there. For the future, briefly, the Archaeological Conservancy will form a local stewardship committee, and they intend, I know from talking with Andy Stout, to include the town of Dresden and the Dresden Conservation Commission in that local stewardship committee. Digs may be run on the property in the future, but they will have to be funded, properly managed, and the results will have to be integrated into what little we already know about the site. Since Land for Maine's Future Board funds are involved, public access to the property is okay, non-motorized access. Any digging or soil disturbance is illegal, but certainly walking dogs, cross-country skiing, accessing the river to fish, and so forth are okay, and at some point we'll all have to make a joint decision where to put a little parking lot and a gate somewhere down that gravel road so people can get in there. That's the non-archaeological part of the story. Now we turn to archaeology. Archaeologists, most of us anyway, think in time scales that are different from normal people. I tend to think in blocks of 500 or 1,000 years for tracking big picture, and blocks of 100 years for very small changes, at least until the advent of Europeans here in historic or written records. This is a timeline of the 13,000 years of Maine prehistory, and these blocks are roughly 1,000 years in radiocarbon time. They're not quite the same as calendar years, but we're not going to get into the details tonight. So think in terms of 1,000 years, which is up here. 1,000 years ago, and think in terms of European history, which you may know better. William the Conqueror landed in England. That was 1,000 years ago. 2,000 years ago, Caesar took Gaul. That's right about in here. 3,000 years ago, or about 1,000 BC, Katie, correct me if I'm wrong, ancient Greeks and their relatives were perfecting the use of bronze weapons, sort of, and they were generating fabulous epic stories that were written down a few hundred years later, right? Okay, like the Iliad and the Odyssey. So that's 3,000 years ago, right there. 3,000 years ago, in this neck of the woods, was the beginning of what archaeologists call the ceramic period, which is one of the most recent period of Maine prehistory. It's also the time period of the recognizable prehistory of the existing tribes in Maine. And yet there are 10,000 years of occupation in Maine before that. And the archaeological site here in Dresden, the one we just bought, covers a period from about 4,000 years to about 9,000 years. We don't need to talk about the end of the Ice Age and Maine's first inhabitants because it's not relevant to the site. By about 10,000 years ago, after the Ice Age, climate warmed up, Maine became covered by a really dense forest. This is a kind of a fuzzy graphic that was done by a professor up at University of Maine Presque Isle about the changes in the forest. It's a timeline that goes from left to right and from top to bottom. So for 10,000 years, Maine Native Americans have been forced to live with a dense forest, forced to travel mostly by water, live on the lakes and the coast and the river. They did travel by trails through the interior, but most of their campsites and village sites are located on water frontage. The period between about 8,000 and 5,000 years ago was actually a little bit warmer and drier than it is today. There were more hardwood and fewer softwood trees in the Maine forest, perhaps more like the forests of southern New England today. So if you want to think into the local environment at the time, think of a forest in central Massachusetts or northern Connecticut for equivalent. For a long period of time after the dense forest cover grew across Maine, about 6,000 years or so, Maine Indians used dugout canoes. This is a reproduction. Dugout canoes are heavy. They're not readily portable. You'd have to have a dugout canoe on every body of flat water that you wanted to canoe on and take a trail between them. You can't move them around. We haven't found any of these ancient dugout canoes. I wish we had. We haven't. But heavy stone woodworking, gouges, chisels, adzes, and other tools used to make the dugouts, and perhaps other wooden objects, are very common for this ancient time period. Archaeological sites of this age are found concentrated on the larger lakes and the larger river banks in Maine. Unfortunately, the coast of Maine has been sinking slowly since the end of the Ice Age. Don't worry about the details. It's mostly bedrock sinking and geological factors, not so much sea level rise. So coastal camping spots, what was coast then is now underwater. In fact, a coastline of about 9,000 years ago is about under 150, 120 feet of water right now. If you want to find the spot where people were camping on the coast, you've got to go way offshore. Indian life in Maine and the Maritimes provinces, as it was recorded when the first European explorers arrived here, was based on the ease of cross-country and coastwise travel in birch bark canoes. About 3,000 years ago or so, it seems, Maine Indians invented or adopted the birch bark canoe. We've not found any birch bark canoes either, at least that we know of. There may be some scraps, small scraps. But Maine and northern New England, the archaeological record changes dramatically just a little after 3,000 years ago, where archaeological sites show up on small streams and small lakes, places you can get to by poling a canoe upstream, a birch bark canoe upstream, or portaging. And so there's some other reinforcing data, but we think that the birch bark canoe joined the list of technology here about 3,000 years ago. Another technological change after 3,000 years ago that created what we think of as traditional Native American life when Europeans arrived was the introduction of the bow and arrow sometime around 2,000 years ago. An arrow must be tipped with a small point, and if it's stone, it has to be fairly small, weighs less than a certain number of ounces. So all stone points that are bigger than that are either spear points, sometimes for throwing spear, or knives. Native people living in Maine over the last 3,000 years also made wigwam-style houses, covered them with birch or other bark or woven mats. They also made clay pottery or ceramics, hence out of the local clay, the blue-gray clay that crops out all over the central coast of Maine. Hence the name ceramic period. Archaeologists aren't all that inventive when we name some of our time periods. The people of New England and the Maritimes provinces spoke closely related languages of the Eastern Algonquian language family when Europeans arrived. There is some evidence from the languages, such as common names among all the languages for bow and arrow or birch bark, that the language family itself may be only 2,000 or 3,000 years old. Think back to European languages. Were there French, Italian, Spanish, etc. 3,000 years ago? Nope. There was Latin and various forms of it, and Greek. So the Dresden Falls archaic site is too old for all of this stuff. It's older than the birch bark canoe, bow and arrow, and pottery. It's older than, basically older than most of what we can say is the prehistory of the modern tribes. So let's turn to the archaeology of the Dresden Falls archaic site. What we know about the age range of occupations comes from Dick Doyle's collection, photographed by Robert Lewis of the Maine State Museum, and a couple of smaller collections that I've seen more recently. Plus, we archaeologists recognize some of these stone tool styles from other sites in New England where they have been radiocarbon dated. The oldest stone points, spear points, are what we call early archaic. These large points with stems with a split or bifurcate in the base of the stem. These are 7,500 to 9,000 years old or so. These graphics with the black backgrounds are all picked up from the site. These are pictures of stone points from the archaeological site in Dresden here. Neville, what we call Neville and Neville variant points are common on the site. They date between 7,800 and 7,000 years ago, roughly. They're quite common around Sebago Lake and west of the Kennebec River also, but they're rare or absent east of the Kennebec drainage. So the Dresden Falls archaic site is one of the furthest east locations where there's a large collection of these points. That tells us something about a cultural boundary at the Kennebec River 7,000 years ago. There were people who made these points commonly all the way out into southern New England and all the way down the East Atlantic coast to North Carolina. So Kennebec River was a cultural boundary, and there were different kinds of stone tools made east of the Kennebec at this time. So there's a decent research question for the site. A couple of what archaeologists call late archaic Laurentian cultures are represented at the site by Otter Creek points. Don't see any there, sorry. And the Brewerton series points, and we suspect that the entire, what's called the Laurentian culture between 6,000 and 4,500 years ago is present at the site. The latest, or the most recent, recognizable stone point style from the site is the Brewerton archaic points, and some of these lower points here at 4,500 years or so. These late archaic cultures had very close ties to the north and the northwest, to St. Lawrence and Vermont and upstate New York, all of which is irrelevant except that we're doing some level of cultural geography at the same time we're doing archaeology here. These things are called stone rods or whetstones. They're busted. They're related. They're archaic in age. We presume that they are whetstones for sharpening all those heavy stone woodworking tools, the gouges and the axes and the adzes. You can actually put a fairly sharp edge on those stone tools and do some pretty interesting, pretty good woodworking with it. There's also a bunch of, they're fragmentary, but they're semicircular knives with a handle on them that was made in the stone. The full object would be about 6 inches long with a sharp edge. They're made out of slate and they're ground. The edges ground on them. It's an analog of the Eskimo ulu. It's the same thing in shape. And there are steel equivalents in a lot of 19th century farm kitchens for chopping vegetables and stuff. There are lots of those on the site. We presume that they're used for cutting fish and other kinds of things like that. There's a lot of these little bits of quartz. They're scraping tools for whittling, making things out of wood or bone. And don't forget that there's a huge inventory of cultural objects that were probably made out of wood, bone, antler, and plant fibers, woven and so forth, that we do not see, except very rarely, because they do not preserve in the archaeological site. Basically, all we've got is stone tools and so a few things that got burned in fireplaces. I'll talk about those later. In 2008, professional archaeological testing on the site consisted of examination of the walls of that power line trench. The landowner was kind enough to re-dig it for me, and I got in there and I walked along the power line trench. He turned off the 220 volt electric line, by the way. It was at the bottom of the trench. And then we did a week of formal test excavation with my archaeological crew. That's what this is. We excavated 17 1x1 meter squares. Then I and friends of Merrymeeting Bay also did 1 day of test pit excavation on that abutting property, the one that was up the hill, in 2010. We excavated 26 1/2 by 1/2 meter squares. Thus, professional archaeologists have excavated about 25 square meters and examined about another dozen square meters in that power line trench. I'd say 40 square meters estimate. This is on a site that covers about 20 acres. There were 80,000 square meters. That's 0.05%, 0.05% of the site area. And everything else is still there underneath the plow zone. Okay, here's the power line trench re-examination. The back dirt that was spread on either side of the trench was loaded with artifact fragments, fire burned rock from fire hearths, and burned bone, calcined bone from food animals. The bones have been chucked into the fires and they burn, and the bone preserves. The soil stratigraphy in the trench included about 25 centimeters, or about a foot, of rusty brown silty sand that had been plowed on the top, and then finer water-laid deposits underneath. And we encountered two features in the wall. I don't know whether the light's good enough, but you can see a dark sort of half-moon shaped stain right there, and there's another one down here. Those are the bottoms of pits or fire hearths from many thousands of years ago, and the top had been zipped off by the plow. But these bottoms of these features yield all kinds of great stuff, charcoal and so forth, including enough charcoal for a radiocarbon date. When we encounter something like that, we don't dig it in the field. We put all the dirt in a plastic bag and take it back to the laboratory, and we screen it on window screen mesh, 1 millimeter mesh, and water in the lab. And we get all the charcoal and the little pieces of bone. We got white quartz chipping debris out of that particular feature, burned fish bone, and one piece of fire burned rock. The base of that fire pit yielded enough wood charcoal to split into two samples. We sent half the sample off for an accelerator radiocarbon date, and it came back 6,130 years, plus or minus 40. And that, if you correct for calendar years, that comes out to be 5,050 BC. I was pretty pleased with that, because that helped out with a grant application. Okay, I said we excavated a bunch of test pits. We covered the site by digging a line that went up the hill and a line across the top of the hill and a few more scattered around. We don't need to go into the details. In some of them, we encountered more fire hearth pit and things below the plow zone, and we left some of them in place and we excavated other ones. The place is loaded. This is what one of the bases of one of those 1 meter squares looked like. There's at least 3 different pit features or fire hearth features that extend below the plow zone, all these dark stains that we've partially excavated here. It's on its side and it's broken. But this is the bottom of a spear point. It's the bottom of one of those Neville points, the 7,000 to 7,800 year old ones. We actually, and that's 1 inch there, so it's about 2 inches across. We found that one right at the bottom of the plow zone in one of those test pits. That also made us very happy. This is the kind of the stuff we get out of digging on this site. There's a tremendous amount of busted up rock. They were going down to the riverbank and picking up the kinds of rock that could be used to make stone tools as cobbles somewhere on the Kennebec River nearby, and all kinds of other things like granite cobbles for hammerstones, and bashing away to get useful stuff. So 90% of what we pick up is the debris left over from the stoneworking. But it all tells us something. One of the most exciting things from the site is that it preserves bone from the food, the animals that were eaten on the site. The bone is preserved as burned or calcined bone, which is resistant to soil acid. That's why it's still here. If you throw a bone out in the Maine woods and the acid soil, it's gone in a couple hundred years. It rots away if the little mice don't eat it first. But burned bone is resistant to acid. So anything that's been discarded into a fire, a hardwood fire, sticks around for archaeologists to find. We have found, we've looked through some of this stuff already. We have striped bass, both backbone and skull bones. Sturgeon bone, this is a piece of sturgeon bone. Sturgeon have bones in their skin. It's called sturgeon scute. A salmon vertebra. This is a modern salmon. That's about an 8-pound salmon. The full backbone diameter, centimeter scale. This is about a quarter section of a salmon vertebra from the site. It's 4 times the size. So there's an 8-pound modern salmon, and this thing was in the 30 to 40 pound range. If anybody says there weren't any Maine salmon going up the Kennebec River 6,000 to 8,000 years ago, well, there were plenty of them and they were bigger. We also have muskrat armbone, turtle shell, and large mammal longbone. This is probably deer. One of the striped bass vertebra is equivalent to a 30-pound fish also, and the salmon's big. A local specialist in charred plant remains named Nancy Seidel examined and identified the charcoal sample from that fire hearth feature in the pit, trench, and 3 other features. A species of trees growing around the site, which were used for firewood, include maple, birch, hawthorn, beech, ash, hornbeam, oak, elm, and white pine. The hardwoods are dominant in the sample. There are a few pieces of acorn, but no other nut fragments. So at least for the seasons that people were using the site, nut harvesting was not a focus of their economy. The archaeological information seems to tell us that they're focusing on fishing as a very important activity. This is a weird little object. It's made out of clay. It's from one of those fire pit features. Part of our method to take the soil from the pit and fire hearth bases back to the laboratory, as I said, was to screen it on, in a bath of water on window screen mesh. That's how we get the small animal bone fragments and the charcoal pieces. And during this process, we recover this curious little piece of clay. There's my gummy thumbs and forefinger for scale. Remember, this site was occupied thousands of years before fired clay pottery was adopted by Maine Indians. So it was a total surprise to see burned or fired clay on the site. This little piece comes to a pointy end. This is the flat side and this pointy end. It's been baked hard in a fire, probably accidentally, since there's not a lot of baked clay on it. And these impressions seem to be of grass, large grass stems or grass or reeds or something, maybe even spartina or some kind of river grass. The flattish end seems to have a rough surface on it. Can't really identify it very well. So it's not a clay pot manufacturing scrap. What is it? I'm just guessing here, but perhaps this is a piece of much larger clay and straw wrapping that was used to bake fish in a fire or on coals or an earth oven. We got to make a positive impression of this and see if somebody can identify what this surface is. But we're down to microscopic detail on the what's impressed in the clay. You never know what you're going to find when you do this. And obviously we need to do more work on this small piece of evidence. So the Dresden Falls archaic site was a major focus of at least seasonal activity for 4,000 or 5,000 years, and then it ceased to be used fairly abruptly. We will be able to reconstruct the local forest vegetation cover from the charcoal. We already know that fishing, including fishing for seasonal anadromous fish, salmon, striped bass, and sturgeon, was a major focus of occupation. In fact, the huge size of the fish will be an important contribution to understanding the ecology of the Kennebec River over time. The amount of ecological change over thousands of years can be very surprising, even here in Maine. Merrymeeting Bay and the friends of Merrymeeting Bay were not here when the site was occupied.
They were different friends. Well,
Friends of the
Kennebec salmon is what
right,
they were.
Friends of the Kennebec salmon. Merrymeeting Bay was not here. Remember I said that relative sea level has changed? The sea level's been rising on the coast of Maine. Actually, the bedrock's been sinking. The range of tide, also the difference between high and low tide, the amplitude of the tide has been increasing over time, so the 8 to 10 foot tides we have today were much smaller in those days. Geologists know this from taking sediment cores along the coast and dating all kinds of sediments with radiocarbon dating and doing all kinds of grain size analysis. Anyway, we believe them. There's no independent way for me to test these ideas, but so 1,000 years ago, the upriver most influence of tide on the Kennebec was somewhere south of Bath. The tide didn't come past Bath. Merrymeeting Bay did not feel the beginning effects of tidal water until about 5,000 years ago or slightly afterwards. And I talked to some professors at Orono who do this kind of work, and nobody's really focused on the paleoecology of Merrymeeting Bay all that much. So they couldn't really answer the question exactly when. And they said, oh yeah, we should get around to that sometime. And I said, yeah, that'd be kind of fun. So the combined outflow of the Kennebec and Androscoggin rivers ended up in what must have been a large freshwater marsh, now where part of Merrymeeting Bay is, somewhere near the confluence of the two rivers, probably flooded seasonally, you know, in spring freshets. With lower sea level and no tide, the shallow channel on the west side of Swan Island here would have been dry. It's really shallow back there. The entire drainage of the Kennebec River came down the east side of Swan Island and around Little Swan and past Goodwin Point, which is, here's a site here. Here's Goodwin Point. It's this bedrock knob, and here's Little Swan Island. So there's Goodwin Point, there's Little Swan Island. The entire flow of the Kennebec came right through here, and there's our site. Between 9,000 and 5,000 years ago, this location here would have been a huge waterfall. The falls existed between Little Swan and Goodwin Point. It's now visible on the topographic map as a bedrock scour in the river bottom. See this contour here? The river drops 20 feet. The bottom of the river drops off 20 feet in depth right below Goodwin Point, right there. That's a remnant of the waterfall. And it's been flooded by the rising sea level. This falls would have been a place where anadromous fish concentrated seasonally. Some species like sturgeon and striped bass do not go over falls, or probably could not surmount the falls. And salmon would have had to pause before heading up the Kennebec. We'll probably also eventually find alewife and a bunch of other fish species in here. And then, if we're guessing right about what happened to Merrymeeting Bay, this falls flooded out as the tide got up here, maybe 4,500 years ago. Maybe that's why the site was abandoned. That's why we call it the Dresden Falls Archaic Site. It's Dresden's huge waterfall. Think of the chops when the tide's out. But the tide was out all the time because there wasn't any tide. So this site seems like a useful place to test a whole bunch of archaeological ideas, and a very ideal place to teach archaeology and provide volunteer opportunities to do archaeology. The plow zone has plenty of artifacts, and places is loaded with artifacts and calcined bone. You can learn how to do archaeology in the plow zone and not mess anything up. It's great fun. You can find stuff. Excavation of the feature fill from below the plow zone and processing by flotation is another great learning opportunity. There is a huge amount we do not know about the time period before 4,000 years ago or so. So who knows what we may learn with a decent archaeological sample from the site. In closing, I'd like to re-thank those individuals who are the unsung heroes of the saga. Donald Saktoma, Land for Maine's Future Board staff who have all recently retired. Tim Glidden, he used to run the program, he's now running the Maine Coast Heritage Trust. Steve Brook and Jim Connors literally walked me through the process. We wouldn't have gotten there without them. Right, Ed? the Archaeological Conservancy and Andy Stout, Friends of Merrymeeting Bay with Ed Friedman and Peter Axelsson, and Dick Doyle Jr. and his collection.
And yourself.
I feel more beat up than heroic. Thank you, everybody. Yeah, I'll take 3 or 4 questions and then I'll talk to people. John.
On the last map you showed, the little Swan Island was there with a similar height of land. I know that going back, time of contact or after that, there was reports of there being a stone Indian fortress on that island.
Huh.
Have you, and obviously it's not threatened land, the state already owns it, but have you or your predecessors done any work out on the island to look for evidence of that sort of thing?
No systematic work. The last guy who was out there was Warren K. Moorhead in 1920 or so. Dug a hole. I found his shovel. I found his shovel from his expedition out there in the bottom of the pit. It was a metal end of the shovel. Okay, yes, sir.
Is it possible for one of us locals to go there and dig?
You mean without a professional archaeologist? Oh.
At that time?
When we do a dig and we make volunteer opportunities available, we will make sure that Maine Archaeological Society, Friends of Merrymeeting Bay, local conservation commission will have opportunities for people, and we'll let everybody know. And yeah, I do that on as many digs as I can anyway, but this is believe me, we're not going to keep people, and there'll be, you can come and, sometimes we arrange it so you can come dig for half a day, and because that's all some people can stand. I mean, it's not all that. Sometimes it's not, anyway. Yes, in short. Another question. Yes, ma'am.
How did you determine where to put the test pits?
Didn't have a lot of time to go through the slide that I showed. We knew a lot about where the artifacts were coming from Dick Doyle's walking over the site and picking up stuff. We knew there was basically artifacts all over the place. So we just did a straight line at 10-meter intervals right up the hill. Right from the wood line on one property line up to the other one. That's a lot simpler than it usually is.
But it's all in a mathematical grid.
Oh yeah, we have data points out there, and we will be keeping everything to like a 1 centimeter accuracy across the whole 28 acres over the future. Yes, sir.
So where are you keeping all the artifacts you find? What's happened to those?
They end up in the State Museum ultimately. Right now they're in my lab in a couple of archival boxes and little plastic bags with tags and numbers and stuff. Yes, ma'am.
Any indication of a spring, freshwater spring on the area?
There is plenty of fresh water around, right, Ed?
Yeah.
There's an old river channel, some kind of an old overflow channel to the east of the site that cuts through, and I don't think fresh water would have been a real problem. Yep.
Geologically speaking, I had, for some reason, I don't know why, but had thought that the land, after the glaciers had melted in the Ice Age, actually rebounded in height rather than sinking.
It did first.
You're right. Yes, it did for about 1,000 years or so, and then it's kind of like a spring, an oscillating spring. The first rebound was a couple hundred feet up, and then it went boom down again, and then it's been slowly coming. The sea level's been slowly coming up ever since. It's a lot more complicated, but it was earlier. The rebound was earlier than people were here. That's pre.
The Ice Age was like what, 15,000 years ago?
The ice started melting around 15,000, and it was gone by 13. People sort of arrived around 12,000, 12, 13. Thank you all. I'll be happy to talk to people individually.